Good afternoon. Good evening, everyone. Our panelists actually span many time zones as well, so we're grateful that you're joining us from wherever you are currently. My name is Sonia Anderson, and I'm happy to be sharing a welcome introduction on behalf of INEE, the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies. Just briefly, this webinar will share a new publication from the Access Research Project, which explores opportunities and challenges to institutionalizing accelerated education programs into national education systems, with research specifically undertaken in Colombia, Jordan, Nigeria, Pakistan, and Uganda. And the Access Research Project is funded by the Aewg Research Fund, which is supported by Dubai Cares in partnership with INEE. This fund aims to strengthen the evidence base in EIE by supporting contextually relevant and usable research and disseminating global public goods. So we're really thrilled to have the Access Research Project funded by Aewg and able to share one of their emerging publications at this point. And I'm just going to give a brief introduction to our panelists today, and then I will be handing it over for moderated discussion, and we will close with, of course, ample time for question and comments from all of you. Just a quick note, please do add any questions that you have in the Q&A. So you'll see the Q&A function likely at the bottom of your screen. That way, panelists may be able to answer your questions as they come in. And if not, we will record them so that we can ensure opportunities to answer them at the close of the webinar. You're also welcome to add any questions you have in the chat, or if you're wanting to introduce yourself, please feel free to do so there. So we are joined today by Dr. Ritesh Shah, University of Auckland and Access Principal Investigator. To ensure we have time for the panel, we're not going to be sharing full bios, but if you do have questions, please, panelists, please follow up after, and I'm sure they can share additional background. We are also joined by Dr. Chima Igbujua, the Access Researcher and National Coordinator in Nigeria, and Ana Maria Restrepo Sanz, who is the Access Researcher for Phase 1 in Colombia. Additionally, we have Rachel Cooper, Education Specialist at Unicef, Emilia Sorrentino, Education and Emergencies Advisor at PLAN, Catherine Cooper, Education and Learning Advisor at Save the Children, and Martha Hewison, Coordinator of Accelerated Education Working Group at INEE. So with that, I will hand it over to Ritesh. Thank you, Ritesh.
Thank you, Sonia. Kia ora koutou, and hello, everyone. My name is Ritesh Shah, and I'm the Principal Investigator for the Access Research Project, based here at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. Access, or what it stands for, which is Accelerating Change for Children and Youth's Education Through System Strengthening, is a 44-month research partnership between the University of Auckland, the Accelerated Education Working Group, and Dubai Cares. Access is founded on the understanding that opportunities for out-of-school learners to have access to and complete alternative and accelerated and accredited pathways of learning is mediated by the wider education landscape, as well as the specific political, economic, and social constraints of that context. But importantly, Access seeks to move beyond just identifying problems, but also highlighting the potential of collective action, mobilized at a national level, but supported by the Aewg to further institutionalize AEPs and other forms of flexible and/or non-formal education provision within national education systems. I will describe more about the two distinct phases of Access in a bit, but before I do, I want to hand over to my colleague Martha Hewison, who will firstly explain how Access fits into the wider priorities of the Accelerated Education Working Group at the present time.
Great, thank you so much, Ritesh. So my name is Martha Hewison. I'm the coordinator of the Accelerated Education Working Group. And just briefly, I'm going to give you an overview of the Accelerated Education Working Group and how it links into this research. So who are the Accelerated Education Working Group, or AEWG? We're an interagency working group of partners working in accelerated education at the global level. The AWG is led by INEE, and it has participation currently of 11 organizations, including donors, INGOs, UN agencies, and others. And the AWG began in 2015 in response to the proliferation of accelerated education programs globally, which look really different from country to country, but even within the same country. The AWG was also developed in response to the scarcity of any guidance or standards or indicators for what effective accelerated education provision looked like. And this was a real key finding from a study by USAID and the University of Chicago, which was conducted in 2016, and it looked at the provision of accelerated education in conflict and crisis. And since its inception, the Accelerated Education Working Group has supported not just accelerated education, but other forms of flexible programming, such as catch-up and non-formal education, or alternative and flexible education. So I'm going to take you on a sort of short journey, not too long, of the Accelerated Education Working Group. So a key task for the Accelerated Education Working Group in the first 2 years was to develop and agree on a common understanding of accelerated education. So one of the first tasks that we undertook was to develop a shared definition for accelerated education. And this was one of the key findings from the NORC, the research that I just mentioned. So the NORC research was trying to compare accelerated education programs globally in conflict and crisis among many different countries. But one of the things they found was that there were so many programs calling themselves accelerated education, and they all looked so different. It was really impossible to compare programs, and there was not one agreed definition of accelerated education. So the accelerated education developed a shared definition for accelerated education, and also for several other programs that we often found were confused with accelerated education. And these are really now the go-to global definitions. After this, we began to look at the learners. Who are the learners that accelerated education programs should target? And this resulted in the development of the decision tree to support where accelerated education programs are an appropriate response and where they are not an appropriate response. And thirdly, we started looking at the key elements for quality. What makes quality accelerated education programs? And we developed the 10 principles for effective practice. And these 10 principles aim to clarify the key components of any accelerated education program globally, and they're really the foundation of all of our tools and guidance. And then lastly, we looked at effectiveness and outcomes. How can accelerated education programs be measured in terms of effectiveness? We developed a learning agenda which guides our research, and a monitoring and evaluation toolkit. So we have this whole range of tools and guidance, including how to develop an accelerated education curriculum. We have some practical checklists for accelerated education. We have a workshop guide, and we have an upcoming accelerated education teacher training pack. So these tools and guidance make up a conceptual framework for accelerated education, and we aim to support the harmonization of accelerated education programs globally. All the Accelerated Education Working Group tools and guidance are available on the Accelerated Education page on INEE, and maybe I can ask one of my colleagues just to put the link into the chat for participants. In 2020, we undertook an evidence review on the impact of an effectiveness of accelerated education. And one of the main findings of that evidence review was that accelerated education programs can't be sustained without them being part and parcel of a national education system, and they won't be effective in reaching out-of-school children and youth. So it's really become clear that we, the Accelerated Education Working Group, need to move beyond the creation of tools and guidance and focus working more on a national level and engaging with governments and strengthening and institutionalizing accelerated education programs. But we really needed some guidance on how do we effectively work with governments at the national level, and more like what does it take to make systemic change at this level? And these are questions that we're really grappling with. Sorry, Ritesh, can you just go back to the other slide?
Sorry. Yeah.
Being over enthusiastic. So all of this work that I've just described to date has really helped us identify our current areas of strategic focus, and you can see them here. We have 5 of them, and we really are trying to ensure how accelerated education programs can be offered at scale and institutionalized within national education systems. So our 5 areas of focus, we have an area of focus working directly with governments to try and ensure that accelerated education programs are part of national education plans and policies. We work to strengthen the evidence base for accelerated education. We have an area focusing on better resourcing by donors, funders, ministries of education, and others for scale and quality. We work to improve the quality of accelerated education. And then our last area is around strengthening the resilience of learners, schools, and systems to respond to crisis. And access falls under the second priority area around strengthening the evidence base, but it also aims to support the AWG on how to promote some of the other areas, namely working very closely with governments in national education plans and policies, and trying to ensure that accelerated education programs are better resourced for scale. And then my last slide. So the work of the Accelerated Education Working Group sits amongst several other actors in education emergencies, developing guidance around more broadly non-formal education, but specifically accelerated education. And I mentioned at the beginning this very significant NORC review and our subsequent development of definitions, of principles, case studies, and a learning agenda. And the Accelerated Education Working Group definitions were used extensively in the creation of the INEE non-formal education taxonomy, which was published in 2021. And most recently, education.org, who are launching their synthesis report today, were guided by a lot of the work the AWG has previously done. And then I also previously mentioned the AWG evidence review we did in 2020. And it was really the key findings from this review that I mentioned earlier about the need for accelerated education programs to be sustained or embedded in national education systems in order for them to be effective in reaching out of school children and youth, and in order for them to be sustainable, and how to support this sustainability and how to support this systemic change effectively led to these questions that we are focusing on in the access research. So one thing that the AWG really hopes to learn from this access research is how do we effectively work at the national level with governments, and what does it take to make or to create the space for systemic change at these levels. So now I'm going to hand back over to Ritesh, my colleague, who's going to talk about the findings from the phase 1 of our research. Thanks, Ritesh.
Thanks, Martha. So as Martha said, I'm going to talk about the key findings. But before we do, I just wanted to give you a sense of the design and the approach that we've taken as a research team, but also as a research practice partnership across each phase of the research. So access is broken up into 2 phases, and we're going to be talking about the first phase today. In the first phase, we worked in Jordan, Colombia, Nigeria, and Uganda, and Pakistan, and we conducted a political economy analysis of accelerated education, non-formal, and/or other flexible education models in these countries. In doing so, what we want to understand is how have these programs evolved over time in the country, the degree to which they meet the needs and aspirations of out-of-school children and youth, and the enablers and barriers to better integrating such programs into national education systems. Researchers in each country some who you will meet later, and others who I can see are in the audience, explore this through an extensive review of existing research in their country, data and evidence on out-of-school children and youth, an investigation of policy regulations, frameworks, and laws governing the education of young people, including those out of school, program level data for AEPs or flexible education models, if available, and key informant interviews with a range of education stakeholders. It's the learnings from this phase of the research that I'm going to share shortly. But what I want to signal first is that the political economy analysis really helped the Accelerated Education Working Group to gain the necessary information to make a decision on where access should continue engagement in phase 2 in terms of supporting processes of institutionalizations of AEPs in national education systems. What our research identified was the importance of supporting systemic change where there are already clear foundations in place, where there are clear windows of opportunity to promote such change, and a confluence between readiness and need for supporting such models of education. In the 3 countries we've selected or were selected for phase 2 of access, which are Colombia, Jordan, and Nigeria, it's evident that there is a high need for supporting greater alignment, quality, and/or coordination of AEPs, as well as windows of opportunity to act now. Where they differ is there are differing levels of readiness to take action. In some of these countries, what is needed first is a space for disparate stakeholders to connect and engage with each other to generate awareness of the wider AE landscape and develop a shared agenda for change. While in others, this platform already exists and there are substantial policy changes already underway. Hence, the 3 countries are at different points in their journey in terms of readiness for alignment, but all sit in the middle to high end of that spectrum. We do expect as a result that the pathways to institutionalizing these programs will look very different. This diversity of context is in fact of significant interest to the AWG as a learning opportunity. So the second phase of the research, which we're now in, involves bringing together a group of stakeholders who have been strategically selected by our researchers and national coordinators for the roles they have in advocating for and promoting institutionalization of AEPs. They can include representatives from government, civil society, teachers groups, donors, and UN agencies, depending on the country. Coordinators have already begun to facilitate regular meetings with these individuals, centered around a mutually agreed to action plan. Our research will track this process of coming together to look at what are the actions that are taking place and inform the ensuing actions that occur after, but also provide important learnings on the types of conditions which hinder or enable AEPs or other non-formal education programs to be better institutionalized into these systems. So now returning to the findings from phase 1, across all countries, when we were doing this analysis, we used an expanded vision of quality to look at AEP provision and how this is influenced by regimes of funding, regulation, and governance. We used Katarina Tomaszewski's Right to Education framework and the concepts of availability, accessibility, acceptability, and adaptability, which allowed us to maintain a learner-centric view to the nature of current AE provision, but then to situate it in the wider social, political, and economic landscape of each country. As you can see from this table, we adapted these concepts to the specificities of AEP provision in terms of both learner experience and the nature of teaching and learning. We found that the concepts align really well with the learner and teacher-focused principles within the AWG's 10 principles for effective practice. So now on to the findings. We unpacked 4 key main issues, which I'd like to discuss one at a time. Firstly, what we found is that while harmonization around a shared set of principles can ensure that AEPs are being designed and implemented in ways that are connected to evidence-based global best practice, on its own, such harmonization does not improve quality. For instance, in Jordan, tight regulation and standardization of delivery of government sanctions AEPs in the country has constrained both demand for and supply of such programs. And in Colombia, we found that the highly decentralized approach to the design and delivery of flexible education models has in fact allowed for such programs to be adaptable and acceptable to the communities they are targeted for, and allowed for a range of different actors to be involved in the process. In Nigeria and Uganda, on the other hand, we found that harmonization has been an important step in establishing common understandings of how AEPs should be designed, delivered, and monitored. There again, though, we found that harmonization is only the first step in that process of improving quality. In Nigeria, for instance, the challenge which remains is to ensure there is both funding and political commitment at both the national and state levels to ensure that these programs are truly available and accessible to the millions of children and youth who could benefit. And in Uganda, the principles have led to the unintended consequence of AEPs being perceived in the eyes of local communities to be superior to formal education provision. This has led to unnecessary and unhelpful dichotomizations between AEPs and formal education provision on the part of national policymakers, when in fact AEPs have a very different purpose and function to formal education. The second issue we identified was the role of the international community in either promoting or hindering the institutionalization of AEPs. On one hand, we found that donors and funders play a significant role in ensuring that learners have increased access to quality AEP programs, particularly in circumstances where they approach this with a long-term view and commitment. For instance, in both Pakistan and Jordan, we identified that the support of the international community over a sustained period has been critical in ensuring that AEPs were increasingly available and accessible. But that over time, there's been a push towards supporting increased government ownership, regulation, and oversight of such programs. And this oftentimes comes through development-related funding streams. Conversely, we found that the historic funding of AEPs through humanitarian channels, such as in Nigeria and Uganda, has led to AEPs being targeted mainly at communities and populations affected by acute emergencies. This has led to a mindset amongst national education stakeholders that AEPs are only relevant for such populations rather than as a more permanent solution to the intractable solutions and challenge and needs of out-of-school children and youth. A third finding was that across all countries, a strong legislative framework exists which acknowledges the rights of out-of-school children and youth to alternative, non-formal education, and sometimes even mentioning AEPs in particular. Yet even within these frameworks, provision and quality of AEPs can remain unequal, particularly in the absence of sustainable funding models. For instance, the decentralized nature of the education system in both Colombia and Pakistan, which transcends as well to funding of education provision and technical assistance and expertise for the design of such programs, has led to uneven coverage and quality and a high dependency on project or program-based support. The result is an over-provision of AEPs and flexible education models in some areas, and the complete lack of coverage and support in other parts of the country. Interestingly, in Jordan, the need to match policy commitments with financial and technical support to the ministry is now recognized by both the donors and the Ministry of Education under the second phase of a multi-donor pooled support fund called Accelerating Access Initiative, or AAI. What AAI will do is strengthen the capacity of relevant directorates of the ministry to support AEPs at scale and meet the commitments to non-formal education it has articulated already in numerous policies and plans. Finally, we know that despite an increasing drive and demand for the measurement and tracking of outcomes of AEPs, there is little evidence of how it is improving the quality and scale of provision at a systems level. This is related to three different issues. Firstly, if systems and structures are not in place to collate, analyze, and disseminate the information being captured at a program level, there's little capacity to understand the impact and relevance of AEPs at a wider scale. In Colombia, for example, it was a significant challenge, particularly because of the decentralized approach to the design, delivery, and regulation of flexible education models. In other words, there was no ability to look at the overall landscape of provision. Secondly, even if systems and structures are set up to collate such data, they're only as good as the users of such systems. In Pakistan, donors have supported the establishment of a robust non-formal education management system to collate this information. Yet this system is not well utilized, mainly because many of those implementing AEPs are either not aware of the system or because they choose to intentionally not enter in data to the system. This precludes having a full or complete picture of the situation at hand. And thirdly, even if program level data on learner outcomes is collected and visible at a system level, it doesn't always lead to improvements in out-of-school youth, children and youth access to quality AEPs. And this is largely owing to wider political and economic constraints that might preclude decision makers from acting on available evidence. Until recently, this appeared to be the case in Jordan. So coming to the title of our presentation, our webinar, where we asked, what does it take to transform opportunities for out-of-school children and youth? Some of you will know that later next week in New York, the global community is going to be gathering together to explore the question of what it means to transform education and meet the obligations agreed to under SDG 4. For out-of-school children and youth, this is a critical question to be asking at present, owing to the fact that to date, our business as usual approaches to getting these learners back into education appear to no longer be working. So there are three important takeaways from Access Phase 1, which we think speak directly to the discussions about to unfold at the Transforming Education Summit. Firstly, what is clear is that approaching transformational change from singular entry points or levers of intervention is unlikely to work. Various interventions and actions need to be aligned, and they need to take into account the motivations of those acting within education systems to act and function differently in relation to the needs of out-of-school children and youth. Secondly, the Transforming Education Summit Action Track papers talk a lot about mobilizing national political will and commitment, but it's less vocal on the importance of the international community demonstrating such equal will. Access indicates how crucial it is that the interest, capacity, engagement of the international community is also interrogated, as often action and funding is currently not being driven by commitment to the interest of the most marginalized learners, but rather by geopolitical and economic drivers outside the country. Thirdly, and encouragingly though, what we found in Access was the importance of recognizing and advancing efforts for systemic change where there are clear foundations already in place. Returning back to the visual developed by education.org's colleagues earlier, transformative change may only be possible where there is a readiness for such change alongside of a need to transform business as usual approaches to education. So now we're going to move to discussing some of these findings with representatives of both the Access research team and the Accelerated Education Working Group. Our panelists have been introduced already, so we're just going to move on to the questions themselves, and I'll be asking those questions. We'll be exploring 5 topics in this part of the webinar. I'm going to be asking the individuals indicated to respond to the questions connected to this topic. I imagine that as you listen to both the questions I'll be asking and the responses, you may have your own questions as follow-up. We encourage you to put these into the Q&A function, and we'll explore some of these further in the last part of the webinar. So I'd like to start with a question to Anna, Rachel, and Martha, noting that each of you have had a different engagement with Access thus far. Anna, I'm going to start with you, and then we're going to move on to Rachel and to Martha. So Anna, as the researcher for Colombia in Phase 1, when you think about the findings and issues that were raised in the synthesis report, did anything really surprise you, or were these things you already knew going into the research?
Thank you, Ritesh. Actually, I'm going to talk about some of the points that you just mentioned and that I found very interesting in the synthesis report. First, the IEPs as long-term solutions, and second, the political will and the role of the external actors in all of this situation. So regarding the first point, a finding that is well known to the education in emergencies community and made evident in the synthesis report was the importance of IEP's provision in the refugee and migrant scenarios, as it was shown in Jordan, Uganda, and Colombia. When education systems are under such stress, like their domestic issues, stress, and additional situations come into play as a migrant influx, these programs seem to be a very interesting, flexible, comprehensive, and appropriate solution. However, the analysis made by you and the other author of the synthesis report is very interesting. IEPs need to be seen not only as useful for acute humanitarian crises, but also as long-term solutions to many other domestic situations. IEPs need to be seen and understood not as competing with or substituting formal education, but as complementary. Because in a world which is increasingly going through migration crises, armed conflict, internal and external, climate emergencies, these contingencies could be part of the strategic planning of national governments for out-of-school children and youth, regardless of their nationality or region within a country. This synthesis made me think of IEPs as a way of fulfilling the promise of quality education for all, wherever you come from and whoever you are. And the second point regarding the political will and the role of the external actors, referring to Nigeria, the report mentions the acute need for funding and political commitment to embed IEPs within legislative frameworks at a national and subnational levels. This is also the case of Colombia, and it was very interesting and sad at the same time to note that in more than one country, the solution to the education crisis is there, not perfect, but there's a solution. And the missing piece or the missing bridge is the political will to strengthen it as a robust strategy to bring out of school children and youth back into the classroom and to strengthen the formal education as a whole. So when leadership is driven by external actors, governments might fail to exercise their responsibility, as it is mentioned in the report. And I wonder if this is part of the reason of why there's a schizoid vision on formal education and education in emergencies, as you and I mentioned before. This, I believe, represents a double-edged sword, and because it is good to have other actors involved, because it strengthens the system and the provision, but if it's driving the governments away, how can we ensure that donors are working from a learner needs perspective and not from their agenda? How can we ensure that these solutions are sustainable if they are largely donor funded? And how can we ensure effective regulation and more monitoring of provision and quality?
Thanks, Anna. And those are all really good questions that I hope we'll be able to explore further in Colombia in the second phase. Rachel, I'm going to ask you now, as a member of the Accelerated Education Working Group task team, been involved with the journey of the research since the beginning. What were your reflections on the findings?
Yeah, thanks, Ritesh. And, I think first I'd really like to echo Anna Maria's point on the importance of AEPs throughout the humanitarian development peace nexus. I couldn't agree more, and I think that really came through strongly from the research. So I just wanted to second that. But I think for me, something that was really striking is the overall lesson that there's been a systematic lack of focus on the actual learners themselves and their needs. And perhaps also linked to this is limited needs analyses in many cases in terms of groups, population groups that require access to programs like AEPs, where AEPs are located, et cetera. And I think, perhaps this shouldn't be entirely surprising from a pessimistic point of view, but I think it's really a stark reminder for all of us, and it's deeply concerning that learners' needs on the whole are not being considered, especially at a system-wide level. So that to me, I think, should be a wake-up call for many of us. I also wanted to flag, Ritesh, you discussed a bit in your presentation the experience from Uganda, which highlights some of the risks of parallel structures and the differences in perception of AEPs and other non-formal education programs in different contexts. And I think this is a really interesting finding that in Uganda, often AEPs are seen as more desirable than the formal education structure. And I think this question of perception is a really big one when we look at alternative provision of education. Typically, one of the biggest challenges is that AEPs are perceived as not being high quality. And, I think there's struggles related to that. But if in cases like in Uganda, where AEPs may be perceived to be of better quality, I think it raises the question, and I don't know if there's an answer to it, but then what is the solution? Maybe in cases like that, can AEPs serve as a model or lessons taken from the successes of AEPs in these contexts to inform formal education delivery? So yeah, I think that was quite striking as well. And then I think this wasn't a finding in and of itself, but the framework that underlies this research and the synthesis report, Tomaszewski's Right to Education framework, framed around the 4 A's, which you highlighted, Ritesh: availability, accessibility, adaptability, and acceptability. I think that this offers a really useful lens for examining AEPs and non-formal education, of course, in the 5 countries that were included in this study, but I think for examining political economy of AEPs in general. And I think, it serves as a broader approach that, I think that we should all be incorporating into our work in education more generally. And I think linked to that, sort of looking at the analysis of the 5 countries of study, I think the research has showed a lot of pros and cons within these 5 contexts, where often maybe 3 of the 4 A's may be done well, and 1 is missing. And so wondering, is there an example out there of a country implementing AEP programs that really does well across all 4 of the A's? Because I think that would be great to see, and I think can help to inform, the guidance that the AEWG puts out and the work of our organizations as well. Over.
Thanks, Rachel. And Martha, you've been involved since the beginning in helping to work with me to conceptualize the research and then roll out access. What was there anything that struck you as surprising from this that has already been said?
Yeah, I mean, I think something maybe in addition that really surprised me was the importance of looking at the wider kind of political economy and its impact on education. I mean, something that I knew, but I was surprised at how important it was, and understanding the political dimensions of the context and using this information to inform policy and programming, and understanding really how the economy impacts on access or those who are not able to access. I think it's really critical, but especially critical when working with out-of-school children and youth. So that's something that really highlighted for me in our work. And something else that surprised me, maybe surprised isn't the right word, but it gave me food for thought, was the importance of contextualization. We've talked a lot, and we have it in the principles that they need to be contextualized. But in the findings, it came up that actually standards may also hinder the adaptability and the accessibility of programs. And I think from the work that we've done, the AWG has done at a national level, I've really found that it's the operationalization and the integration of the principles that's really effective. So developing action plans and seeing how well programs align or don't align with the 10 principles has been really effective in supporting actions to improve quality. but I think this learning from access to really ensure that the principles have been sufficiently contextualized and do not generalize, and really importantly, do not hinder the ability of programs to adapt, is a learning that we really need to emphasize moving forwards. Thanks.
Thanks, Martha. Really interesting responses to that one. Kat, we're going to move on to another question now. So we're going to move on to Kat and kind of thinking about your role. You know, you're advising Save the Children programs around the world on the role of it, on the question of, you know, how do you scale up and improve the quality of education provision for out-of-school children and youth in varying contexts? And so what finding from this research kind of most challenged the prevalent way you or your organization has been thinking about this?
So I'm going to be a bit of a broken record because I think there were two findings that I highlighted, sorry, being greedy and selecting two, but there were two findings that really struck me, and both Anna Maria and Rachel have highlighted that these are the ones that really stood out for them. I'm just going to quote both of them because I think the first one particularly is quite shocking. So this is a finding that the international aid architecture and infrastructure around it does not take a learner-centric approach to engagement with and action within education systems, and this undermines any potential for transformative change. I mean, this is quite a shocking finding, and really concerning considering our long history of working in AEPs as Save the Children, and I think particularly echoed in the Uganda finding about the government saying that they feel that AEP is competing with the formal education system. And I think as Save the Children, we take a real participatory, child-focused approach to the design of our projects, and it's challenging to try and work out how do we maintain that our programs are learner-centric, but trying to consider how best we work within the education system to scale those up. So just something that we really need to keep in the back of our mind, that delicate balance. And then the other one, which I think Anna Maria talked a lot about, so I'll try and be succinct, but just the finding that funding for AEP often comes through humanitarian financing channels. And just to quote the report, it says, this has led to a perception on the part of national education stakeholders that AEPs may only be relevant in acute humanitarian crises rather than as a long-term solution to the needs of the millions of other out-of-school children and youth. So for me, this is something that's been a challenge within Save the Children, within our own structure around EIE versus long-term development programming, and where does AEP fit within that? And I think it's also within the donor sphere that AEP is also included within these short-term education and emergency response programs, and tailored towards out-of-school children and youth who've been out of education for multiple years. So it's a really huge mindset shift, both within our NGOs, but also in terms of positioning ourselves with donors to promote AEP as a long-term solution, so not just in the humanitarian response. And that should be included with the national education system. And I think that's also become a little bit more problematic recently in the post-COVID era, with the focus on short-term catch-up programming, which is of course a relevant response for children who've been out of school for less than a year, but trying to still keep those long-term out-of-school children and youth within the forefront of donor thinking for kind of longer-term responses for them.
Thanks, Kat. And no, you don't sound like a broken record. I think you've reiterated two really important points. Rachel, what about you? Anything kind of, what was your kind of take on that?
Yeah, no, I think, you know, looking at the findings from the synthesis report, I think about it in terms of UNICEF's approaches, education approaches that touch on accelerated education and alternative education more broadly. Part of that is the RAPID framework that was developed by UNICEF, UNESCO, and the World Bank as part of learning recovery efforts in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, which includes a focus on increasing catch-up learning as part of learning recovery. So that's, part of in terms of COVID response and learning recovery responses. But then looking more broadly, UNICEF's secondary education guidance, which focuses on multiple flexible pathways for secondary age learners, which of course includes accelerated education programs. And I think closely linked to this also is our transferable skills framework, which really focuses on providing young people the full range of skills that they need through a variety of types of learning programs and modalities, including accelerated education programs, recognizing that the formal education system is not and can't right now fully serve all children and adolescents, especially given the huge numbers that are out of school. And so with that in mind, at UNICEF, we're really focusing more on multiple flexible pathways for out-of-school adolescents, looking at systems level support that countries need. And so I think, this builds on our existing frameworks, approaches, and methodologies. But I think that there's a number of interrelated findings from this study, which are highlighted in the synthesis report that I think are really critical considerations for UNICEF's work in this area. I think, they all come down to the issue of equity and reaching the most marginalized. And I think the research brings up important caveats that need to be considered in order to be effective as well as scalable in this respect. I think, something that was clear to me that I think is an important consideration is the criticality of focusing on advocacy and engagement alongside or as part and parcel of system strengthening, and the important role, of course, of government counterparts in order for systemic change to be possible. There was the finding from Nigeria and Uganda, which highlighted this importance, and saying that if advocacy and engagement do not work in tandem, the risk is that efforts to align AE provision will fail to improve the quality and accessibility of AEPs for learners who need and demand them. And I think, when we engage in countries on system strengthening for AEPs and multiple flexible pathways in general, I think that, the criticality of having an engaged and willing government partner to further these efforts is really important. As the research piece frames it as having a clear opportunity window driven by a confluence of global, national, and local interests in doing things differently. So I think that that's a very important consideration. I would also flag, I think it's widely recognized that a lack of financing is a huge constraint at the secondary education level. And for children and adolescents of secondary age, for them to access learning opportunities. And I think that came through a couple of findings in the synthesis report as well. And I think, it was well summed up in the piece with this line that even with a strong policy and legislative framework and recognition and integration of AEPs into education strategies and plans, provision and quality of AEPs can remain unequal, especially in the absence of a sustainable funding model. And so I think a lot more effort really needs to be focused in this space in order to reach the most marginalized out of school children and adolescents. So yeah, that's it from my side. Thanks, Ritesh.
Thanks, Rachel. Amelia, I'm gonna hand over to you now and ask you another question, which is, you're someone who's worked quite a lot across a number of complex humanitarian crises in your time. And I think one of the interesting points raised is about the international community, particularly in humanitarian context, sets in place particular precedents that are then hard to change down the track. I'm just wondering, based on your experiences, have you seen this in action? And have you seen examples also of where working in AAPs in a humanitarian context can then lay the foundation for transitioning into a longer term developmental response?
Thank you, Ritesh. Yeah, definitely. I'm happy to bring here the experience that we have had and we still have actually in Cameroon and in Nigeria. Actually, Nigeria is also part of the research, where we have contributed to the development of AE programs based on the AE 10 principles. In Nigeria, in partnership with Save the Children, in Cameroon, in a consortium led by NRC. So these programs were designed to address the education needs of older age out of school children in regions affected by humanitarian crisis. Now, while the Lake Chad emergencies has exacerbated the learning crisis in both countries, on the other side, I must say, has created an opportunity for PLAN and its partners to advocate with ministries as well as with international donors for an investment, increased investment in accelerated education. There have been some key factors that have created an opportunity to build in this program some work that is more focused on system strengthening and therefore on longer term objectives. These key factors have been, one, the close collaboration with the Ministry of Education since the AE curriculum development and its pilot phase. The other factor has been the strong coordination on the ground among accelerated education actors, including the AWG members. The other factor has been that the possibility of access multi-year funding. And in both countries, we have had some key donors, including the EU through Recovery Fund, ECHO, ECW, and the USAID. And I have to say also the ability of partners to create synergies, among programs and make sure that, that there was funding available to actually build more developmental, response in the work that we were doing in humanitarian context. Now, what have been the results? The results in Nigeria, for instance, a national accelerated working group has been set up, whose members have been consulted for and involved in the development of accelerated education national guidelines for the scaling up of the program countrywide. This group is also becoming a reference for national organizations as well as state authorities who want to implement accelerated education in other parts of the countries. And also, this group is actually working on the development of work plan for the institutionalization of the accelerated education program in the national education. So the integration of the accelerated education program in the national education program under the universal basic education. In Cameroon, PLAN and its partners are currently working with the Ministry of Education on the preparation of an accelerated education national forum. The scope of this forum is to bring national and international stakeholders to work on a roadmap for accelerated education delivery in country. And looking at aspects such as the scaling up of the program countrywide, as well as the adaptation of the curriculum to the Anglophone region crisis, and build some sustainable transition pathways. Now, despite all these achievements so far. Of course, there are some challenges. In particular, if we want to look at more developmental work. For instance, education plans and the policies for accelerated education provision should take into account some structural challenges. Among those challenges, I think about the poor capacities of formal education system to reintegrate A learners. The challenge of having limited availability of qualified teachers, as well as a limited offer of alternative education pathways for youth, in particular, I think about adolescents, youth aged between 15 and 18 who do not want to reintegrate the formal system. So this is one of the challenges. Another challenge definitely is localization. What we have seen in Cameroon is that the engagement of national organization in AP provision is still very weak. We need to strengthen the role of national organization in the provision of accelerated education, as well as in the planning. And this, of course, will be a key step to ensure local ownership as well as sustainability. Another important point is the coordination among education authorities in country. We have talked about decentralization. If I think about Nigeria, you know, we have the federal ministry and then the state education authorities. So the coordination between the national level and the decentralized level, but also the coordination between state authorities. For instance, those who are responsible for the non-formal education provision where often accelerated education fall under, and then those who are responsible for the formal education provision. And this is important and key, for instance, for transition pathways. One other key aspect is the evidence base. We need to strengthen the evidence base. If I think about Cameroon and Nigeria, it's an important point. And on top of that, I would like to add that we need to use we need to conduct evidence-based advocacy with donors who are funding longer-term education programs. And I think about the World Bank, for instance, or GP. Thank you.
Thanks, Amelia. And I think some of those points about Nigeria, I can see are being taken forward now in phase 2 as well. Martha and Kat, I'm going to ask you to if you can, just provide a shorter response to the next question. And I think we've touched on it to some degree already, which is really thinking about how this is now going to influence the work or the agenda of the AWG moving forward. How do you think it's going to have that influence based on what phase 1 identified? Martha, do you want to go first?
Sure, thanks. No, I think the access research and the findings are really important, and they're already really impacting upon the, I guess, the focus of where the AWG works and how we work. And I think going forward, it was already clear, but now I think it's really clear that we should focus more working at a national level and engaging directly with governments. And I think that the future of the AWG is really not developing any more tools and guidance. I think we have enough tools and guidance, but really disseminating them and really working at a national level and engaging with governments. And then a second area I think that is important is in these workshops that we do, we always invite education stakeholders. And speaking to my point at the beginning, which I was surprised about, I think that we, we don't invite actors outside of education. So we always invite the Ministry of Education and other education stakeholders. But I think in some of these national level workshops, considering the importance of the political economy, we really need to invite a wider group of stakeholders. So we need to engage the Ministry of Social Affairs or Ministry of Gender or Youth. And I think, again, this is really important when working with out of school children and youth. So I think we need to take a little bit more of a holistic view as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Martha. And Kat, what would you say?
Yeah, so I agree. Obviously, I agree with Martha. And I think building on what she said, I think thinking about the role of NGOs within the AEWG, just thinking about as the AEWG moves towards more looking at how best can we work with national governments in our role as NGOs, thinking about how can we work more closely with governments as they're implementing partners, whether this is kind of looking into capturing existing best practices or coming up with guiding principles for this kind of engagement. And I think this can hopefully ensure that NGO administered AE programs are delivered within an existing education system as a collaborative effort rather than a standalone intervention. Obviously, this requires a great deal of sensitivity from NGOs because, and going back to my early point, because we need to deliver the best quality AEP that is learner-centric, meets the needs of out-of-school children and youth, whilst not drawing children away from the formal school system or setting up a temporary system that appears more attractive. And I think too often as NGOs, we're focusing on the former, on getting the best quality programming without kind of maintaining that longer term perspective and ensuring that we work collaboratively with government stakeholders and take our time to really embed AEP in national systems and getting the correct balance. So hopefully that's what we'll achieve moving forward.
Yeah, not an easy ask and definitely a long journey ahead, but yes, it's good to keep that in mind. Chima, and someone who I've had the personal pleasure of working with, firstly as our access researcher for Nigeria for phase 1, and now as the national coordinator for phase 2. There was a lot of mention of Nigeria in the panel, but I'm interested to actually hear from you on what have you seen as kind of the benefits or points of difference of this research practice partnership thus far, now having worked on kind of in 2 different roles. And Chima, I know that you're not able to turn on your camera, so I'm just don't feel the pressure to turn it on.
Yeah, thank you, Ritesh. Very unfortunate. I couldn't put on my camera. It's been troubleshooting. I don't know what's happened. And thank you for the question. I think this is something interesting to me, particularly being involved, having been involved in this research beginning from phase 1. Also given my previous experience, as a researcher, I can easily pick out 3 benefits so far that I think are very outstanding to me. One is the fact that Access is attempting to redefine the age-long research partnership that had promoted the power imbalance between the global north and the south. Some of us who are coming from the other side really feel we don't belong to the system, we're not part of it. Because when you talk of research partnership, it's always like, these are the laws, and whatever they tell you to do, you just do it and get away from it. No recognition, no participation as a full member of the team and the system. But Access, gave us a different view, particularly myself, because since I joined with this mind view, but then it's something changing already because we've been working as a team. The procedure, the process gave me hope as an individual. It's okay, yeah, we can really work together as a team, irrespective of where you're coming from. You're not defined by the fact that you're coming from the global south, but you are defined based on what you can contribute. So I think that is the first thing, giving every member of the team that opportunity to contribute to the system. I think the second thing to me would be in terms of capacity development. Being involved in Access from phase 1 has built my capacity as an individual. And this is also because of the way the research was designed from the beginning. Every one of us, irrespective of our location, we were given that power, that opportunity to come up with our research framework, the scope, the kind of instrument we want to use, and who we want to interact with in the course of the study. And it was an opportunity for everybody to learn. And thank God again for those who are coming from the other side. They didn't see themselves as being lost. They learned from us and we learned from them. So this one benefit I can easily talk about in terms of being involved in the assets research. Now, again, because everyone has something to contribute and everyone learned from each other, everyone, it was just a great opportunity for us to interact and improve our assets. Every meeting we had was an opportunity for us to learn, it was an opportunity for us to share ideas and improve our assets. And again, another benefit I should not forget is the fact that, going forward in phase 2, the design also have given the stakeholders, the nationals, the opportunity to design what they want to do. How do you institutionalize AE in the country? What do you want to do? Nobody is bringing something to you to say, okay, this is how I want you to do it. We're all together thinking and brainstorming. Oh, this is how we are going to go about it. This is what we want to do. Oh, no, we don't need to do this. We need to, because we have the context, we understand our nation, we understand what actually are the problems. So that's the design is something that I think is giving the stakeholder that opportunity to own the process and to be proud of it in the long run. And again, for us as a country in Nigeria, I think this is something very strategic because one, the issue of out of school children and youth is something is become like a phenomenon for us in this country. And there have been this brainstorming, what do we do? So access is giving us opportunity to solve that national problem. And I think there is no other benefit that one can talk about than this. So I should limit this to these 3 points as per the benefit of the research partnership for me as one being involved from the beginning even to this point. Over.
Yes. Thank you, Chima. And I'll just say, it's the feeling is reciprocal, I think, in terms of for me as the researcher, but also I think for the AWG. We're gonna move now to questions and answers, and I know that we don't have a lot of time. So Sonia, I'll let you kind of maybe cherry pick a couple of the questions that you think you want to throw out, and maybe we just choose one person or 2 people from our group to respond to this.
Perfect. Thank you, Ritesh, and thank you to all the panelists for your answers thus far, and for all of the participants for your fantastic questions. There's a couple comments, so again, much appreciated for those reflections. And then there are some questions that have already been answered, but I think let's take a look at a question from Tom Lowe. So with the RAPID framework, heavily promoting accelerated education in the COVID-19 recovery, do you see this as a window of opportunity for longer term reform and investment in accelerated education approaches? And this can be for you, Ritesh. Maybe we'll start there and then I'll grab a couple more as you're answering quickly.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think this question of, is COVID an opportunity or does it present new challenges for accelerated education programs is the kind of a live debate at the moment. I think one of the risks at the moment, and I think it was touched on, is this idea of the conflation of accelerated education programs with short-term catch-up remedial programs and who they're targeted for and what the purpose of them is. And I think we need to remember before COVID, we had the out-of-school children and youth challenge. And if we look at the global data over the last 5 years, that number has pretty much stayed plateaued at its constant. And this was, pre-COVID and following COVID. So I think COVID is an opportunity to talk more about the concerns around out-of-school children and youth. But I also think that we shouldn't position AEPs as a rapid response. I think it needs to be situated as more than a rapid response. It needs to be seen as kind of a permanent, long-term feature of systems that have large numbers of out-of-school children and youth.
Great, thank you, Ritesh. Another one from Tom, from Martha. If implementers secure short-term funding for accelerated education programs under the RAPID framework, do you have any guidance on how short-term programs could be designed, implemented, evaluated to advocate for longer-term funding for AE programs?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Tom. I think that it's tricky and we always advocate for longer term funding for accelerated education programs, but I think aligning your accelerated education program with the national education systems and the national education structure, which are part of our principles, they're principles 9 and 10, will really support, you know, government engagement, and it will I guess ideally then it would be great to have those integrated into the national system and have the Ministry of Education financially support. But I think that donors seeing, you know, that it's not a parallel system, again, it's going back to this parallel system, but you're ensuring that the, you know, the curriculum you use, the certification is recognized, that there's a transition back into the formal system, would all really support funders continuing or scaling up or going from short-term to longer-term funding. So really aligning it with the national education system and working with the Ministry of Education, I think is really critical.
Thank you, Martha. So just 2 more questions that I'm going to note, and then we'll wrap up. So one of them is specific to this research. Ritesh or Martha, feel free to address this. So can you speak on the process criteria for selecting the initial countries included? And then a final question, was there any engagement with private sector providers of accelerated education and their role or not in national systems or in the accelerated education working group in the political economy analysis? So putting that out there as a final question as well.
I can start, and actually, if Anna doesn't mind, in terms of that question around engagement with private providers, I think that's an interesting one specifically for Colombia, where that exists a bit more, and maybe Anna can talk a little bit about that landscape and how the research engaged with some of those private providers in the first phase. But in terms of the selection of the country, what we were looking for were really a diversity of contexts that were both familiar but also less familiar to the AWG, context where systems and structures of educational governance, decision-making, financing were quite disparate, regional diversity, and also I think in some ways, I think that the main thing was an opportunity to learn. So the AWG didn't want to do the research in countries where it was already, you know, really knew a lot about. It wanted to kind of dig deeper into contexts where it could be an opportunity to learn. Martha, anything you wanted to add before I hand over to Anna on that?
No, I just think that, as you said, and we really wanted to ensure this kind of wide geographical spread. And then we also wanted to consider countries that we felt were in very different contexts, but also different stages with their accelerated education programs. So some centralized, some very decentralized, some with a lot of government engagement, some with no government engagement. So we really tried to get, I guess, just a broad I don't know what the word is, a broad selection of countries and of context to ensure we learned as much. And just hand straight over to Anna, because I can see what they're going to run out of time. So Anna, please.
Yes, so regarding Colombia, as Ritesh mentioned at the beginning, this is a highly decentralized education system. So that leaves space for different type of stakeholders to come into the scene and play a specific role. So when we were doing the research of the first phase, we had private sector, public sector, we had local NGOs, international NGOs, all the humanitarian stakeholders. And the private sector is really interesting because I'm going to say this in a very, I don't know, weird way, but they have the money to do these type of programs. So they play a very important role when the government is not present, and when the humanitarian aid leaves a specific region, because the private sector can stay for a longer time, but also they choose where they want to stay and where they want to intervene. So even though they play a very important role, I still think that it's very important for all the stakeholders, when they are not part of the government, to be put together in the same scenario and coordinate their actions, because then we have populations that are in very much need but are not being attended because it's not part of the specific agenda of a private entity or the humanitarian aid. So that's the importance of having all the stakeholders brought together into the same coordination and into the same game, or playing the same rules.
Great. I know that we are at time. There are a few more questions that came into the chat. Martha, Ritesh, if you'd like to take a couple minutes, I'm happy to read them and direct them to folks, but I'm also wanting to be respectful of people's time joining at odd hours. So let me know as you prefer.
Martha?
Well, I think maybe we can take one more. I know it's like past midnight, it's bedtime in New Zealand for Ritesh, so I think maybe we'll just have one more, and also other colleagues. I know I have to go and pick up my son from hockey practice and things, so maybe just one more, and then we'll, I think, wrap up. Thanks, Sonia.
Perfect. Yeah, absolutely. And just a huge thanks to all the participants for your engagement. So the final one from Rosario Garcia, one question that came to mind: should we not get governments involved in the conception of AEPs instead of getting their support once the programs are ready or have been developed? I think that AEPs became institutionalized. If AEPs became institutionalized, this would put under question the length and format of the formal education system, and this scares governments away from it. So a question around involvement of governments throughout the timeline of developing these programs.
That's a really good question. And I'm wondering if I can actually throw that one to Chima, our national coordinator for Nigeria, because I know that Chima's been thinking a lot about this, particularly now that there's a move to scale up AEPs to parts of the country where they haven't existed prior. So Chima, do you want to talk a little bit about involvement of government from the very beginning in the conceptualization of these programs and how that might look?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that, Ritesh. I think from Nigeria it's been different, because from the beginning it's been government. Understandably, some NGOs started doing some work, but government had to come in to say, we need to formalize the process. We need to create a system to make this program a bit more qualitative. So government came in from the beginning in the design of the curriculum, the pathways, the guidelines. It's been government-led, and even at this stage, because in our own context, the problem is huge, and government is thinking of, we really need to find a solution to the problem of almost 20 million out-of-school children and youth. So government is not even thinking the other way around to say, okay, how would this not have negative impact on the formal system? The main focus is, how do we solve the problem? And solving the problem, that's why the government in Nigeria has put forward a framework, the guideline, to say there is a restriction. These are the age range for those, and there are criteria for enrollment. It's not just all comers affair. So I think it's all up to the government to put up a very good structure to ensure that AEP does not turn to be something negative in the course of implementation. And I think in Nigeria, we've been able to get that right, to put up a framework to say, this is the age range, and these are the criteria for enrollment. It's not for everybody. And we're enforcing that wherever AEP is being implemented in the country. Over.
Thank you, Chima. Back to you, Sonia.
Thank you, everyone. just a quick note and closing on our side that all of the background information and publications discussed today are available on the Access webpage and the Accelerated Education Working Group webpage on the INEE website. So please feel free to follow up on both of those sites for additional information and reach out to any of our panelists with additional questions. We will also be sharing a recording of this webinar if you'd like to go back and reference, or if you'd like to pass it on to colleagues. And we encourage you to stay up to date with this research project. A huge thanks to all of you for joining at various odd hours, to our panelists as well, to the entire Access research team, and of course to Dubai Cares for supporting the eCubed Research Fund. Any closing words for Tesh or Martha?
No, thank you, Sonia, for doing such a
Wonderful.
great job of hosting it today. Thank
My
you.
pleasure. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening or morning.
Yeah,
Thank you so
wherever
much.
you are.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Bye. Take care.
Bye.